The Pacific War had reached a turning point. By 1944 and 1945, the once unstoppable Japanese Imperial Army was facing a series of defeats. The jungles of Guadalcanal, the beaches of Saipan, and the volcanic rocks of Iwo Jima had become graveyards for thousands of soldiers who had once sworn never to surrender. Yet amid the smoke, hunger, and exhaustion, a few did lay down their arms. Their capture marked the beginning of an experience they could never have imagined. For the Japanese soldier, surrender was more than disgrace. It was considered worse than death. The Bushido Code taught them that capture meant eternal shame for themselves and their families. Many were ordered to fight to the last bullet, to charge with bayonets when ammunition ran dry, or to take their own lives rather than fall into enemy hands. Suicide, in the form of grenades clutched to the chest, or leaping into the sea with rifles in hand, was often seen as the only honorable escape, and yet hunger gnawed deeper than honor. Wounds became unbearable, diseases spread like shadows through the jungle, and isolation cut off entire units from their command. Men who had once shouted "Banzai" with fearless voices now whispered prayers into the dark, wondering if tomorrow would be their last day. For some, surrender was not a choice. It was the final instinct for survival. The moments of capture were rarely dramatic. They were often quiet, almost fragile. A lone soldier, ragged and barefoot, would stumble from the trees with hands raised. Sometimes a group would emerge together, gaunt faces streaked with dirt and hollow eyes watching nervously. Their uniforms, once symbols of imperial pride, were torn and stained, little more than rags hanging from emaciated bodies. American soldiers who witnessed these surrenders often felt a strange mix of shock and pity. They had been taught to see the Japanese as ruthless, unfeeling fighters who never quit. Yet here were men, little more than skeletons, trembling as they handed over rifles or swords. Many of them could barely stand. Some collapsed before a word was spoken, too weak to resist or even to explain themselves. In Saipan, stories spread of Japanese civilians, women and children, jumping from cliffs rather than be captured. Soldiers, too, sometimes followed this path. The propaganda drilled into them had been relentless. Americans were portrayed as monsters, demons who would torture and kill. To walk into the arms of such enemies was unthinkable. And yet, when desperation overcame the myths, surrender became their only reality. For the prisoners, the moment of capture was a blur of emotions. Shame burned deepest. Eyes dropped to the ground, unable to meet the gaze of their captors. Many wept quietly, not out of fear for themselves, but for the dishonor they imagined their families would feel. In their minds, they had betrayed the emperor, the nation, and their ancestors. Fear was close behind. Every glance at an American rifle, every barked command, carried with it the terror that perhaps execution awaited. Some POWs later recalled expecting to be lined up and shot on the spot. Others feared torture, convinced they would be experimented on or humiliated. It took time, sometimes days, before they began to realize that capture did not always mean cruelty. The Americans, for their part, often treated the prisoners with an unexpected restraint. Orders were strict. Prisoners were to be disarmed, searched, and transported under guard. Yet there were also moments of humanity. A soldier might offer a cigarette, a sip of water, or even food. For men who had not eaten properly in weeks, such small gestures seemed almost unreal. The journey from battlefield to prison camp was itself an ordeal. Prisoners were marched under the scorching Pacific sun, watched carefully by guards who feared ambush or trickery. Any sudden movement could provoke gunfire. Yet the marches revealed something striking. The prisoners were often too weak to plot escape, too broken to resist. They staggered forward on swollen feet, ribs protruding through their skin, coughing blood into the dust. During transport by ship, the fear of the unknown grew stronger. Locked in holds, listening to the engines thrum beneath them, the prisoners whispered among themselves. Would they be executed upon arrival? Would they be used as propaganda, paraded before cameras to shame Japan? Or would they simply vanish, swallowed by the sea without record? The uncertainty was worse than hunger. For many, capture also meant a strange sense of relief. The jungle, with its endless mosquitoes, leeches, and the constant smell of rot, was behind them. The cries of dying comrades, the thunder of artillery, the chaos of banzai charges. These sounds faded into memory. For the first time in months, perhaps years, the prisoners were no longer fighting for every breath. Instead, they faced a new reality: survival as captives. This first chapter of their imprisonment was not about comfort, it was about endurance. They were herded into makeshift cages, fenced compounds, or guarded barracks. They were counted, searched again, and watched constantly. But amid the humiliation and fear, something unexpected began to stir: curiosity. What would the Americans do next? Were the stories true, that they tortured prisoners? Or was there another reality, one they had never been told? Little did they know, their first true surprise was still to come, not in the form of punishment or interrogation, but in something far more ordinary, far more human: their first shower. When the prisoners finally arrived at the American camp, they were too drained to process what lay before them. The journey from battlefield to barbed wire compounds had stripped them of strength and dignity. Their bodies ached, their clothes clung to their skin with sweat and grime, and their eyes darted nervously from one guard to another. The camp itself looked alien to them. It was not the dungeon or torture chamber they had imagined through months of propaganda. Instead, it appeared almost orderly: rows of wooden barracks, watchtowers looming above, and fences strung tight with barbed wire. Soldiers patrolled with rifles at the ready, their boots clicking against gravel paths. Every movement carried authority, and yet there was no immediate cruelty. Still, the prisoners' minds raced with fear. The voices of Japanese officers echoed in their heads: "The Americans will skin you alive. They will use you for experiments. They will make you suffer worse than death." Such warnings had been drilled into them so deeply that even when a guard offered water, they hesitated, unsure whether to sip or suspect poison. Groups of prisoners were herded into holding areas. There they waited, silent, watching their captors with wary eyes. Some tried to appear stoic, folding their arms or staring at the ground as if defiance could still mask their vulnerability. Others shook uncontrollably, unable to contain their terror. A few whispered to each other, voices trembling, "What will they do to us?" Then came the orders that deepened their unease. One by one, groups were selected and told to strip off their filthy uniforms. The prisoners exchanged anxious glances. In Japanese culture, modesty and discipline were deeply ingrained. To remove their clothes in front of enemies felt humiliating. Some resisted at first, clinging to their tattered garments as though they were the last fragments of their honor. But the guards were firm, and eventually every prisoner stood exposed, shivering more from shame than from the breeze. When they were told to line up, many assumed the worst. The bare bodies, the unfamiliar instructions, the sound of pipes hissing nearby, it all stirred dreadful suspicions. Some recalled rumors whispered on battlefields that Americans gassed their captives, sealing them in rooms disguised as bathhouses. Others thought they might be scalded with boiling water, a slow torture meant to break their spirit. The shower room, from the outside, offered little reassurance. It was a squat building of concrete and pipes, with steam rising faintly from vents. The guard's tone was brisk, not cruel, but the prisoners could not understand every word. To them, the gestures, pointing toward the doors, waving them forward, felt ominous. Inside their minds, battlefields replayed themselves. They thought of comrades who had chosen suicide over capture. They remembered officers urging them to clutch grenades rather than live as prisoners. And now, standing on the threshold of this strange building, many believed death had simply been delayed. Some POWs later recalled that their hearts pounded harder than in combat. At least in battle, the enemy was visible, the cause clear. Here the threat was hidden, cloaked in silence and uncertainty. A few whispered prayers to their ancestors. Others clenched fists, as though preparing for an invisible fight, yet curiosity mingled with dread. The smell of soap drifted faintly through the air, foreign, clean, almost sweet. It was unlike the stench of sweat, blood, and decay they had grown accustomed to. Could it truly be a bath? Could their captors, whom they had been taught to fear as monsters, intend something as ordinary as cleanliness? The guards motioned them forward. Barefoot, the prisoners shuffled across cold concrete floors, their steps echoing in the chamber. The sound of dripping water reached their ears. Overhead, pipes twisted like skeletal limbs, ending in nozzles that stared down at them. The sight made their stomachs tighten. Were these guns? Were these traps? Some men froze in place, unable to take another step. Guards had to nudge them, sometimes with the butt of a rifle, sometimes with a stern command. The language barrier deepened the terror. A shouted English phrase meant nothing to a man who could not understand, except that danger was near. The line of prisoners grew restless. Eyes darted from ceiling to floor, searching for signs of death. One soldier whispered, "Gas." Another muttered, "We will not come out alive." Their fear fed on itself, multiplying in the silence, and then the waiting stretched unbearably long. Standing naked in the humid air, the prisoners' minds spiraled further. Every hiss of a pipe, every clang of a metal door, sounded like the signal for their execution. They braced for pain, for choking fumes, for the end. But the guards remained calm, almost indifferent. They adjusted valves, spoke casually to one another, and gave no hint of malice. The contrast was baffling. Could it be possible that this was not a chamber of death, but simply a shower? The prisoners' disbelief was absolute. Their culture had prepared them for harshness, not kindness. Their propaganda had painted the enemy as devils, not men who offered soap and hot water. And so, standing on the edge of this moment, their minds clung to suspicion. What lay ahead would shock them, not because it was cruel, but because it was humane. Yet in that instant, before the water fell, they could not imagine such a thing. To them, the shower room was a riddle, a mystery wrapped in dread, and as the first drops of water hissed from the pipes above, their world was about to change. The pipes hissed. For a moment, every Japanese prisoner inside the room froze, hearts hammering in their chests. This was the moment they had dreaded. The sudden rush of gas, the suffocating death their officers had warned them about. Some clenched their fists in defiance, others closed their eyes to meet death in silence. But then, instead of choking fumes, drops of water splashed down. At first it came in bursts, cold metallic-tasting sprays that startled the men and made them recoil. A few gasped sharply, expecting poison to seep into their lungs. They staggered backward, eyes darting to the doors, to the guards, to the ceiling above. But no death followed. Slowly, the trickles turned into steady streams. Warmth spread across their shoulders, their backs, their hair. Steam rose as the water cascaded over their dirt-caked bodies. The sensation was alien. Many had not felt running water on their skin for months, some for years. Jungle rains were harsh and cold. Rivers were muddy and filled with insects. This was different. It was controlled, soothing, relentless in washing away the grime that clung to their skin like a second uniform. The prisoners exchanged confused glances. Could it be true? Was this not death, but a bath? An American guard tossed a bar of soap toward the floor. It slid across the wet concrete, stopping at the feet of a trembling soldier. He bent to pick it up, holding the pale block as though it were a weapon, unsure of its purpose. He had heard of soap, of course, but few had ever used American-made bars that foamed so easily. With hesitant movements, he rubbed it between his palms. To his astonishment, bubbles formed. Soft, white, fragrant. The fragrance was unlike anything they had known. It carried notes of clean cotton, of sweetness, of something almost medicinal. As the foam thickened, curiosity overcame hesitation. He lathered his arms, his chest, watching the gray layers of filth melt away under the slick surface. His skin, once hidden beneath months of sweat and mud, reappeared. Others followed. Bars of soap were passed around, and soon the chamber was filled with the sound of scrubbing. Fingers dug into hair, pulling at mats of grime. Nails clawed at skin, peeling away layers of dirt that had become part of them. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were not soldiers, not prisoners, not enemies. They were simply men, washing themselves clean. Yet the experience was not without its strangeness. Some still cast wary looks at the guards, convinced that perhaps the water was laced with something unseen, a slow-working toxin. A few scrubbed too quickly, rushing as though the gift might vanish at any second. Others laughed nervously, a sound that startled even themselves, for laughter had long been absent from their throats. As the foam spread, the room seemed to transform. The naked, shivering figures no longer appeared as defeated warriors, but as human beings rediscovering the simplest comfort. Drops of water traced lines down hollow cheeks, carrying away the shadows of war. For some, the sensation brought tears. The warmth of the water mingled with the salt of their grief, flowing together down their faces. The soap worked deeper than the skin. It began to peel away layers of suspicion as well. With each stroke, with each rinse, the prisoners realized that this was no trick, no hidden cruelty. The Americans were giving them something they themselves had almost forgotten existed: dignity. One man, a corporal who had fought in Guadalcanal, later described the feeling as returning to life. He remembered the stench of rotting comrades in the jungle, the endless weeks without bathing, the crawling insects in his uniform, to stand under warm water, to feel foam between his fingers. It was as though he had been reborn. The guards, for their part, watched with detached patience. Some even smirked at the sight of hardened enemy soldiers, marveling at something so ordinary. To them it was routine, just hygiene, nothing more. But to the prisoners it was a revelation. As minutes passed, the tension eased. The room filled with the sound of splashing water, the rhythmic slaps of hands scrubbing skin, the occasional sigh of relief. A few men dared to speak, their voices low but lighter than before. They pointed out the soap's foam, laughed at the white bubbles clinging to their beards, or marveled at the feel of their own clean skin. For some, the moment carried painful irony. They remembered fellow soldiers who had chosen suicide rather than capture, men who would never know this strange mercy of the enemy. They thought of families back in Japan, of children and wives who might never believe such stories of kindness from Americans. And yet, here they were, standing in streams of warm water, their shame washing down the drains with their dirt. As the session drew to a close, guards signaled for the men to rinse off. The water slowed, then stopped, leaving the chamber filled with dripping bodies and rising steam. The prisoners stood quietly, steam swirling like ghosts around them. Their skin glistened pale against the harsh light, yet they felt lighter, freer, almost unrecognizable to themselves. When clean garments, simple camp-issued clothes, were handed out, the men accepted them with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. The scratch of new fabric against freshly washed skin felt luxurious. For months they had worn only uniforms, stiff with sweat and blood. Now they stood clothed not in military pride, but in something profoundly human: cleanliness. The experience lingered in their minds as they were marched back to the barracks. Many remained silent, each lost in thought. Others whispered, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was this a strategy to weaken their will, to soften them for interrogation? Or was it something else entirely? An unexpected glimpse of humanity amid the brutality of war. That night, lying on hard bunks, the sensation of soap and warm water still clung to their skin. They touched their arms, their hair, almost unable to believe it. For the first time in months, they did not smell of death and decay. For the first time, they felt human again. The shower had been more than hygiene. It had been a revelation. And though they could not yet admit it, deep inside it began to plant the seed of a dangerous thought. Perhaps the enemy was not as monstrous as they had been told. The barracks were quiet after the showers. Rows of cots creaked as weary bodies settled into them, the faint smell of soap still clinging to the air. For the Japanese prisoners, the sensation of clean skin was almost disorienting. They touched their arms, their faces, their freshly washed hair, as if trying to convince themselves that it had really happened. For months, sometimes years, they had lived in filth. Sweat had been their second skin, blood their companion, and the stench of rot their environment. To feel clean again was not simply physical, it was emotional. It was a reminder of something they had nearly forgotten: that they were human beings, not just soldiers, not just prisoners, not just tools of war. At first they did not know how to process it. Shame still lingered. Their capture was a mark of dishonor in their culture, and many felt crushed under the weight of failure. Yet alongside that shame, something unexpected stirred: relief. The hot water, the soap, the fresh clothing, they spoke a language beyond politics, beyond propaganda. They spoke of care. One prisoner later recalled that when the guard handed him a towel, he hesitated. He half expected it to be taken back or for some insult to follow. But nothing happened. The guard merely moved on, handing towels to others with the same calm efficiency. The prisoner said that in that moment, for the first time since his capture, he felt seen not as an enemy, but as a man. This was the first flicker of humanity. The change was subtle at first. Conversations, once hushed and fearful, grew slightly bolder. A few men dared to share thoughts they had buried. "Did you smell the soap?" "Like flowers," another murmured. "The water was warm, like home before the war." These simple words carried power. They connected the men not through their shame, but through a shared rediscovery of life's small mercies. For many, memories resurfaced. A soldier from Okinawa remembered his mother scrubbing his hands before meals, her soap smelling faintly of pine. Another recalled the bathhouses of Tokyo, steam rising as neighbors gathered to wash after long days of work. The shower had unlocked something in them, not just cleanliness, but remembrance of family, of childhood, of ordinary life before the endless march of battle. And with those memories came questions. If the Americans were truly the devils their commanders had claimed, why allow this? Why give their prisoners dignity? Why not leave them in filth, broken and humiliated? The answers were not clear, but the doubts were enough to shake the certainty of propaganda. The guards themselves became part of this shift. They were firm, yes, but not cruel. They barked orders, but they did not strike without cause. Some even offered cigarettes, a gesture so ordinary it felt extraordinary. A cigarette, passed from captor to captive, became more than tobacco. It was a bridge. It was a small act of recognition. You are alive, and I acknowledge that. At night, lying awake, the prisoners wrestled with conflicting feelings. Loyalty to the emperor still burned in their chests, and shame for surrender gnawed at their pride. But alongside these emotions was gratitude. Gratitude that they were still breathing. Gratitude for soap and water. Gratitude, even, toward the very enemy they had once vowed to kill. This was dangerous ground for them. To feel gratitude toward the enemy felt like betrayal. Yet humanity has its own logic, one that transcends orders and ideologies. The body, once cleaned, begins to heal. The mind, once given a taste of dignity, begins to awaken. One young prisoner wrote later that the shower washed more than my skin. It washed my heart. He had gone into the room expecting death. He had come out reborn, not as a soldier of the emperor, not as a machine of war, but as a man who realized he could still laugh, still feel, still exist beyond the battlefield. The laughter, though faint, did return. In the days after the showers, prisoners began to notice each other differently. Where once they saw only shame and defeat, now they saw comrades rediscovering bits of themselves. A joke about soap slipping from hands, a smile at the sight of foam clinging to someone's ear. These small moments cracked the shell of despair that had imprisoned them longer than the barbed wire ever could. To the Americans, it was routine. To the Japanese prisoners, it was revelation. In their own culture, honor and shame had defined everything. To surrender was to lose honor, to lose face, to lose identity. Yet here, stripped of their uniforms and bathed like ordinary men, they discovered that humanity could exist even in dishonor. That being alive, being cared for, was its own kind of honor, an honor not tied to death but to life. It was the first step in seeing the enemy differently. If an American could hand you soap, could let you wash, could give you clean clothes without mockery, then perhaps he was not a demon after all. Perhaps he was human too. The prisoners did not admit this openly. Pride was still strong, and the fear of judgment from fellow captives kept their voices cautious. But in private thoughts, in silent moments, they felt it. The humanity of their captors had awakened the humanity within themselves. This did not erase the war. It did not erase the deaths of comrades or the memories of battle. But it planted a seed that in time would grow into something powerful. The recognition that even in the midst of war, enemies could treat each other as men, and that recognition changed everything. For the first time since their capture, the Japanese prisoners did not see themselves only as defeated soldiers. They saw themselves as people who could still laugh, still dream, still hope. The simple act of a shower, the warmth of water, the scent of soap, it had reminded them of who they truly were. It was the first feeling of humanity. When the Japanese soldiers were first captured, their minds were clouded by fear, suspicion, and humiliation. They were raised in a culture where surrender was considered shameful, almost dishonorable beyond repair. In their military code, dying for the emperor was more noble than being taken alive. So, when they became prisoners of war under American control, their expectation was clear. Cruelty, torture, and humiliation awaited them. This belief was not born from thin air. It was deeply embedded in Japanese wartime propaganda, which painted the Americans as ruthless barbarians. But reality inside the camps turned out to be starkly different. Instead of the brutality they feared, the Japanese POWs were met with a kind of treatment they had never imagined from the enemy. The showers they were introduced to were the first crack in their wall of suspicion. Yet, it was not only the showers, it was also the consistent behavior of the American guards and camp officers that slowly began to reshape their perception of the enemy. At first, the prisoners approached every interaction with hesitation. A shouted command or even a loud footstep would make them flinch, expecting punishment or violence. But the American guards rarely resorted to brutality. Their instructions were clear, their discipline was firm, but there was an absence of unnecessary cruelty. This was new, almost alien to the Japanese soldiers. In their own army, discipline often came with physical punishment. But here, in the hands of the enemy, they discovered a strange balance between authority and restraint. The first meals they received in the camp became another eye-opening experience. The Japanese soldiers expected starvation, maybe rotten food thrown at them as a form of insult. Instead, they were given proper meals, sometimes even warm food, served in an organized manner. It wasn't luxurious, but it was far from the cruelty they anticipated. For men who had marched for days on empty stomachs, even bread and soup felt like a gift. It was not only about filling their bellies, it was about dignity. The Americans didn't throw the food at them like animals. They distributed it in lines, as though the prisoners still held some measure of humanity. The guards themselves also displayed behaviors that seemed almost unthinkable to the Japanese POWs. Some guards, while maintaining their authority, showed small gestures of normal human interaction. A soldier offering a cigarette or a medic dressing a wound without ridicule left deep impressions. For the prisoners, these were not grand acts, but subtle signals that shattered the image of the bloodthirsty American savage that wartime propaganda had drilled into their minds. The impact of this behavior went deeper than just comfort. It created confusion. The prisoners had to reconcile two conflicting realities: the propaganda that shaped their beliefs versus the reality they were experiencing daily. On the battlefield, Americans were enemies to be killed without hesitation. But inside the camp, these same Americans were displaying a degree of fairness, even kindness, that seemed incompatible with that image. One Japanese prisoner later described how disorienting it was to see American soldiers laugh and joke among themselves. In Japanese military culture, laughter during war was rare. It was seen as weakness or dishonor. Yet the Americans could be both disciplined soldiers and relaxed human beings at the same time. This duality challenged the rigid worldview of the prisoners. Another striking aspect was medical care. For soldiers who expected to be left to rot, the fact that American doctors treated their wounds was astonishing. To them, it was incomprehensible. Why would the enemy waste medicine and effort on men who had fought against them? But for the Americans, it was standard procedure under the Geneva Conventions. That difference in philosophy revealed itself in every aspect of camp life. Over time, as weeks turned into months, these small but consistent actions accumulated. The showers, the meals, the medical care, the absence of random cruelty, all combined to shift the psychological state of the Japanese POWs. They began to feel something dangerous in the eyes of wartime propaganda: respect for the enemy. This respect didn't mean they stopped being prisoners, nor did it erase the shame they carried. But it did plant seeds of doubt about the narratives they had believed. If the enemy was capable of such treatment, then perhaps the world was not as simple as they had been told. Perhaps the Americans were not demons, but men. The most profound impact came from the realization that mercy could exist in war. For the Japanese soldiers, mercy was not something they expected. Their own military system emphasized sacrifice and cruelty as the price of discipline. But the Americans, while still keeping them confined, allowed a measure of humanity. That contrast left many of them reflecting on the differences between their military culture and that of their captors. Some former prisoners would later admit that these experiences changed the way they saw not only the Americans but also themselves. The respect they developed was reluctant, born out of lived reality rather than choice. And yet it endured. The American behavior inside those camps left an invisible mark on history. It showed that war, even in its brutality, could carry moments of unexpected humanity. For the Japanese POWs, this realization was as transformative as the first showers they received. The enemy they had been trained to hate had treated them not as animals, but as men. And in that recognition, they rediscovered fragments of their own humanity that war had nearly destroyed. When the Second World War ended in 1945, millions of soldiers around the world attempted to return to normal life. Among them were the Japanese prisoners of war who had lived through captivity in American camps. For these men, the experience of surrender, imprisonment, and eventual release remained one of the most profound chapters of their lives. Many carried scars of shame for being captured, but they also carried vivid memories of how the enemy had treated them, memories that would stay with them long after the war ended. In the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender, the repatriation process began. Ships transported thousands of POWs back to their homeland. For many, the return was bittersweet. On the one hand, they were grateful to set foot on Japanese soil again. On the other, they faced an uncertain welcome. In Japanese society, surrender was dishonorable, and POWs often carried the stigma of being failed soldiers. Families sometimes looked at them with mixed emotions, relieved to see them alive, yet burdened by the cultural shame attached to captivity. But despite this shame, the former POWs could not forget what they had seen and experienced in the camps. The showers, the medical treatment, the fair distribution of food, and even the small gestures of kindness by American guards became stories they carried in their minds. For some, these memories softened their views of the enemy and made them reconsider the rigid propaganda they had once believed. Years later, when these men were older, many gave testimonies and interviews about their experiences. Historians and researchers noticed a recurring theme. While they spoke of hunger, boredom, and confinement, they often highlighted the surprising humanity shown by their captors. One former POW described the first hot shower he ever took in an American camp as a moment of rebirth. Another remembered how an American medic patched up his wound without hesitation, even though he was the enemy. These small but powerful memories became central to how they narrated their time in captivity. The impact of these recollections extended beyond personal memory. They became part of a broader historical understanding of how American treatment of POWs differed from Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners. While Allied POWs in Japanese camps often endured starvation, forced labor, and cruelty, the Japanese soldiers in American hands experienced conditions that were strict but generally humane. This contrast became an uncomfortable truth for Japan as it reflected on its wartime conduct. For some Japanese veterans, their time in American captivity even helped reshape their post-war lives. A few admitted that witnessing the discipline and organization of American soldiers, combined with their ability to remain humane, left a lasting impression. They realized that strength did not always have to be accompanied by cruelty. This realization influenced how some of them raised their children, emphasizing not only discipline, but also compassion. Others struggled to reconcile their experiences. They wondered why their enemy had treated them better in captivity than their own army had treated them in service. The Japanese military system during the war was notoriously harsh toward its own soldiers, often subjecting them to brutal punishments, starvation, and a rigid hierarchy. To be treated with more dignity by the enemy than by one's own commanders was a deeply unsettling thought, and it forced many veterans to question the system they once devoted themselves to. As Japan rebuilt itself in the post-war years, these memories quietly contributed to the nation's gradual transformation. While not all former POWs openly spoke about their experiences due to stigma, those who did helped foster a narrative that the enemy was not entirely monstrous. This, in turn, helped soften relations during the occupation and later decades, as Japan and the United States transitioned from bitter foes to allies. Historians also note that these testimonies highlight an important lesson. The way prisoners of war are treated can leave long-lasting marks on international relations. The humane treatment of Japanese POWs by Americans became part of a larger story of reconciliation. Decades later, when Japanese and American leaders stood together as allies, these small acts of humanity during wartime were remembered as threads in the fabric of peace. In Japanese literature and memoirs written by former soldiers, the memories of captivity often reappeared as symbolic turning points. Some described the showers as cleansing not only their bodies but also their minds. washing away layers of propaganda and hatred. Others reflected on how they had come to see their captors as ordinary men, not monsters. These reflections were not always easy to share in public, but within the privacy of personal writings, they became part of the inner healing process. By the time these veterans reached old age, many had come to terms with the duality of their experience, shame from surrender, but also gratitude for survival. When asked what they remembered most, some answered with surprising honesty, "The enemy treated us as humans." That simple statement carried the weight of decades of reflection. In the broader historical context, these memories serve as a reminder of the power of humanity, even in the darkest of times. Wars are fought with weapons and strategies, but they are remembered through stories. And the stories of Japanese POWs reveal that sometimes the smallest acts, a hot shower, a bandaged wound, a fair meal, can carry more weight than battles and victories. Today, when historians reconstruct the past, the recollections of these men provide valuable insights into the psychological and cultural transformations brought by captivity. They remind us that war is not only about destruction, but also about encounters between individuals from opposing sides. In those encounters, humanity can either be crushed or rediscovered. For the Japanese POWs, the memories of American behavior, the showers, and the surprising compassion they received became lifelong reminders that the world was more complex than propaganda had taught them. These memories were passed down to younger generations, not always in the form of grand speeches, but in subtle lessons about dignity, respect, and empathy. In the end, the historical impact of these recollections is profound. They not only shaped personal lives, but also became part of the collective memory of a nation coming to terms with defeat, survival, and rebirth. For those men, the war did not end when they left the camp. It lived on in their memories, in their reflections, and in the quiet realization that even in war, the enemy had shown them what it meant to be human.